Alright, welcome back, and it's time to do the version 2.8 performance test. Now, I gotta say that the last several updates have been quite buggy. 2.6 was quite buggy, 2.7 was especially buggy from my personal experience. 2.8 is also buggy, but not as bad as the previous versions. However, 2.8 does have some rather large issues. One such issue is the lack of reflections on the new map. I mean, they do work, but you can actually see the reflections get turned off for whatever reason that happens. There are some rendering issues, some sound issues that I've noticed, but the main issue that we will be talking about today and that we will be experiencing today would be the lack of Vulkan, or should I say Kura removing Vulkan from all the supported devices. Now, you can forcefully enable Vulkan through the configuration file if you want. You can always do that, but the reason why Vulkan has been removed is the fact that apparently Vulkan is causing some issues. There are some issues with the game being stuck in a crash loop if you have Vulkan enabled, and I think it's either that or the game crashing when you teleport. Now, I personally haven't experienced that myself. As you guys know me, I usually play the game on Vulkan. I haven't experienced that issue, but the Vulkan option has been removed from the settings. Now, it's not removed from the game. You can still enable it, but you can't enable it the classic way. You have to enable it through the configuration, through the custom configuration way, which I'll actually do near the end, and I'll actually do a little stress test on the new configuration file. That, I mean, I have like 20 of them at this moment, 25 actually. You'll see them later in this video. So here we are. I have reverted all the configuration files to default. This is the default game config, basically how the game will look on all the mobile devices and tablet devices. I have all my necessary monitoring applications and windows enabled, and as you can see, all the options are here, but when you scroll down, you will notice, where is my Vulkan? There is no Vulkan at the moment, because it's disabled, but you still do get frame generation. And you can still enable frame generation on non-supported devices as well, but that's a story for a different video. If you want me to show you the custom configuration file that I use and stuff like that, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I'm more than happy to share what I use for the game. And here you can take a look at the game news. Vulkan is disabled for now, temporarily disabled. It's been more than a week, I think, since it's been disabled, so it seems to be a rather large problem. I don't know exactly what could potentially cause that to help, because I haven't experienced any issue with Vulkan myself. I have experienced no problems with Vulkan, flatlining 60 FPS or 120 FPS, or in between, depending on what settings I use. Now, the new map is honestly one of my favorites. Kura has knocked it out of the park with the new map, and you will see later that you can actually make this map look much nicer than it already is. There are some things within the map that annoy me a little bit. Some lack of some animations and stuff like that, which would have like zero impact on performance. I mean, the game doesn't really use that much CPU or GPU on default. Like, it doesn't use anything actually when you look at the frequencies and the total load, you realize that this game doesn't really utilize a lot of GPU. Even on Vulkan, it doesn't really utilize a lot of GPU. And it's actually a quite big misconception with the game that this is a GPU heavy game. It's not. This game doesn't really use that much GPU. You can make it a GPU heavy game if you want, through a custom configuration by bumping up the resolution, which I will do later. Then you can actually get this game to be properly GPU heavy or properly hardware heavy. But on default, this game doesn't really stress the 8 Elite much. 60 FPS doesn't really pose a significant challenge for the 8 Elite. I mean, even 120 FPS on default is not a big challenge for the 8 Elite, but it will be very funny to see how will frame generation perform on OpenGL. Now, one thing that I don't like to use is frame generation plus OpenGL, because frame generation in this game and OpenGL are not really big friends from my experience. Frame generation does not like OpenGL, and OpenGL does not like frame generation. They just don't work properly when you use them side by side. But Vulkan plus frame generation does work wonders, and it's overall a much stable, smoother, and a more enjoyable experience. But we'll just do this for fun. I will go and I will actually go and do a 120 FPS test, because we all know 60 FPS is no challenge and no big problem for the 8 Elite, but 120 FPS plus OpenGL, that's a rather interesting combination that I actually want to see how it will perform. And well, let's do some of the boss battles, which should technically pose some form of, hopefully some GPU utilization will be seen here. But we are at 120 FPS, beautiful. Now, since this device is working the way it's working, it's in performance mode obviously, but I didn't really force it to go into melt mode, basically to ignore temperature. We'll actually see when the FPS will drop and when the frequencies will drop. Now, since I am on OpenGL, it is kind of expected to see some frame drops on frame generation. Again, frame generation does not like OpenGL, it doesn't really work well with it, but still, we are getting 120 FPS, some minor dips because we didn't see a GPU frequency bump when required. Vulkan does actually solve that quite nicely, and with Vulkan you actually do get that extra boost when needed. So on Vulkan the FPS is constantly 120 FPS. And the other rather large, I would say, difference would be in thermals. Vulkan is approximately 10 to 20 degrees colder, or in some cases up to 40 degrees less heat on Vulkan, which helps tremendously with frame generation and with the overall frame rate that you will get. But we are hovering at 101 degrees Celsius. The CPU is at 99, 100, so pretty much around even. We are still within the optimal working temperature for the 8 Elite. The maximum allowed temperature is 105 degrees Celsius, and based on that temperature, the chipset or the GPU or CPU will either bump clocks up or will prevent itself from actually bumping the clocks up to prevent even more heat from generating, and that's when you might experience throttling on the 8 Elite. But again, it is quite difficult to get the 8 Elite to throttle. After all, this thing is kind of made with heat in mind. I actually didn't believe that myself, but here I am with an 8 Elite, using it for nearly a year now, and so far it's been performing incredibly well. No issues from my personal experience from using it. It keeps the GPU frequencies quite high, the temperature is also quite high, but the FPS is also quite high. So yeah, this is pretty much what you would expect from OpenGL and frame generation. While it's good, while it is definitely way above average for a mobile device running this game, 120 FPS on a mobile device on Wuthering is kind of impressive by itself. But with Vulkan you would get much more stable frame rate, and honestly, if you have an 8 Elite, or if you generally want to play around with frame generation, if you have a supported device that can have that enabled, I would definitely encourage to try out Vulkan first, because with Vulkan you will get better heat output, or should I say less heat output. Now, when we go and play the city here, and I think this is where kind of the throttling kicked in, or it's either throttling kicking in or OpenGL being OpenGL and just ruining experience and ruining frame rates as OpenGL usually does. But honestly, as much as I bash OpenGL, it's good to have a backup option, you know. If the game had no Vulkan switch, if the game switched completely to Vulkan, for example, we would be kind of in trouble, because the game would crash for some players. Now, I wouldn't have that issue, but many other players would have that issue. Thankfully, you do have the switch and you have the backup option. Now, Kuro does acknowledge that Vulkan is better, so I'm not worried that Vulkan will be gone forever. I mean, it can be gone forever, you can always enable it. This is a sneaky little thing that... actually, how long has it been since I've been playing around with the configuration files? It's been more than a year now, I think. Definitely a couple months. And I think at this moment Kuro is mostly aware, they have to be aware, that players are using the configuration files to set up their own graphics. And since it hasn't been blocked off, or since it hasn't been addressed, I think they kind of let players make the game look the way they want. And I'm extremely grateful for that, because not many games allow you to do that. And I gotta give Kuro credit to some extent here, or actually to a lot of. I have to give them a lot of credit here. They are one of very few developers that didn't treat Android incorrectly, or should I say, one of very few developers that treated Android with full respect and with actual full capacity as they should. They don't treat your Android device as a bootleg device, or as a, they don't treat your Android device as a second thought, as certain other game developers do. And some game developers of a game that I was very excited about did do the same thing, where they lock your graphics, lock your settings, and I was very disappointed in that game, to the point where I think I didn't even apply for the beta. I was so disappointed. All of my happiness for the beta test, upcoming beta test, which should be coming in a couple days now, maybe tomorrow actually. I lost all of my interest in that, because those developers seem to be locking frame rate, ray tracing, and graphics to a certain fruit brand. Let's put it that way. Meanwhile, Kuro here allows you to do whatever you want with the graphics, and they also treat all the platforms in a equal term, giving them equal settings if possible. I mean, some of the other devices don't support some features, and that's fine. But if they support it, they do allow you to use it. And that other game that I was very excited about, unfortunately, doesn't seem to do that. So yeah. More reasons to stay loyal to Kuro, I guess, because so far these developers have knocked it out of the park, and I'm a simple man. They treat me with respect, I treat them back with much more respect. So that's just how it is. So that was the map exploration. I actually kind of want to go and do more of that. Now, should I go back to 60 FPS? Nah, I think I'll just stay 120 FPS. Again, I think 60 FPS is silly for the 8 Elite. We have to bump that up to more. 120 FPS is the correct frame rate for the 8 Elite. That's the proper frame rate for the 8 Elite, to actually put that GPU to use, to put that hardware to use. I didn't pay to use a fraction of the power of this thing. I didn't pay €1,000 for this thing. Just look at it. I'll use it to its full potential if possible. Now, the new map does bring some improvements to lighting, to overall shadows, to reflections, and I would say overall ambience. The visuals do look nicer now than before, and I've been told that some form of ray tracing is added to mobile. However, I'm not exactly sure what kind of ray tracing, whether software based or if it takes advantage of the hardware ray tracing units on supported devices. I did see some custom configuration files that say that they enable ray tracing. I did try them out. Personally, I didn't notice the ray tracing effect, or if it's there, I would say it's not really that noticeable. The one thing I noticed through these configuration files is that the overall global filter is maybe playing the biggest role to get that ray tracing effect. So I don't know if it's actual ray tracing or if it's ray tracing masked as a global filter tweak. I'm not really sure, honestly. Could be a combination of both. I kind of want to experiment that myself. I kind of want to experiment with that myself a little bit more. Because honestly, if there is ray tracing, then I might have already been using it for quite a while without noticing it. Maybe that's why the reflections look so good, and maybe that's why the reflections suddenly started to eat up quite a lot of the GPU. If you watched some of the previous tests, or maybe even in this test, depending if I stumble upon a water area, you can notice the GPU frequency skyrocket when I am near a watery surface or a reflective surface. When I zoom in, especially when I zoom in into the water, the GPU frequency goes all the way up to 100% in some cases. So not really sure if that's because of the reflection commands that I did use in the custom configuration file, or if that's because of ray tracing taking its effect. In any case, if you're wondering about ray tracing in this game, probably coming up very soon. My estimate was version 3.0. That's when I would personally expect ray tracing to make its way into the game. Maybe it's already in the game in one way, in one form, in the form of having better lighting and overall better shadows in some cases and reflections, which is, I would say, more than enough to get that ray traced effect. We will see that on the custom configuration file that I'll boot up at the end of the video here, because I really want to see how it will perform on OpenGL. Obviously, you can't have ray tracing on OpenGL. Ray tracing is not going to work on OpenGL. It will work only on Vulkan, because OpenGL doesn't have the ray tracing extensions to make it work. It can potentially have it, but they would have to update OpenGL, and OpenGL is pretty much legacy at the moment, outdated, nobody's using it anymore, so I wouldn't expect that feature on OpenGL. So again, Vulkan is the way to go with this game for the future. Well, wasn't that bad. The FPS is pretty good for OpenGL, not gonna complain about that. The heat, definitely, the heat is the main enemy when you're using OpenGL in this game. So you definitely would have to go and use Vulkan if you want reduced heat. And speaking of Vulkan, I think it's time to get that custom configuration file going, and it is time to do a little stress test of the 8 Elite for this little new map. Now, the stress test is built, or should I say the configuration file is built from maximum quality. There is no corner cutting, there is no reducing this, reducing that. No, everything that can be maxed out is maxed out, with the purpose of pushing the hardware to its limits and to kind of show me what I could potentially improve on this device. Speaking about this device, the thing I need to improve is the charger. 25 watts is not going to cut bypass charging. This thing can draw more than 25 watts. So I need a 45 watt charger. I've been speaking about that for months. Didn't have time to buy one, unfortunately. Time is something I don't have lately. But a 45 watt charger would drastically improve the performance of this particular 8 Elite, because it would allow the 8 Elite to draw as much power as it wants. Right now, I'm kind of capped at 25 watts, because that's how much the charger can pull from the wall. And I actually measured the wattage, how much it pulls without the battery, in bypass charge mode from the wall. It pulls 25 watts on this game on a custom configuration file. And the other thing that I would somehow need to improve is probably the heat, because if you want 120 FPS, you definitely need to have some pretty beefy, hefty cooling, which is difficult to achieve because of the way the chip is located inside of this device. However, that is only if you're playing on 120 FPS. 60 FPS is manageable, and you can easily do 60 FPS on 4K, which is what I'm about to do here now. I actually seen the game switching out Vulkan for OpenGL upon the next reboot, so you have to basically put the configuration file every time. If you want to boot in Vulkan, you have to go copy paste, put in the right configuration file, and then launch the game, because if you don't do that, the game will automatically revert back to OpenGL, because again, the option is disabled by default. However, it never done this before. This is the first time that the game automatically does disable or override Vulkan even once you set it up, so that's kind of a new thing, and it has to be a serious issue with Vulkan that Kuro has done a automatic override upon every reboot of the game. First time you put it in, it will work. Second time you launch the game, it will be back to OpenGL, so you have to make sure that you double check that every time you open up the game to make sure that Vulkan is actually being used upon every reboot, or should I say upon every launch. So Vulkan is being used. Now let me go and enable all of my lovely applications that I love to use, and we will be putting the 8 Elite for a little stress test. Now I said the throttling limit is 105 degrees Celsius, and I will gladly say the limits of this device. Now 4K is overkill by any standard on a mobile device, and just because you can do something, doesn't necessarily mean that you should. However, if you have a tablet with an 8 Elite, or if you have a tablet with the new 8 Elite Gen 5 or whatever the name is, then if you have a high resolution display, you can easily set 4K or 1440p or 800p resolution, whatever native resolution you have, on a big screen that has that resolution. It's worth it. However, if you have a 1080p panel like I do have here right now, 4K is overkill. 1080p would be more than enough, so you don't have to go 4K on this game. Native resolution is more than enough. Unless you're on a tablet, go 4K, no complaints from me. If you want, of course, you can set 4K if the hardware allows it. Still no Vulkan switch. It's hard. It's hard off for Vulkan now, but the game looks absolutely beautiful. There is no complaining from me when it comes to the graphics of this game, and we are still in 60 FPS. The resolution is double of 1080p from the custom configuration file. Lighting, reflections, all of that has been manually improved through the configuration file, and honestly, the game looks much better if you do use a custom configuration file. Much better. I mean, just night and day difference. The main difference is definitely in the resolution. It's super sharp, although I kind of want to tone down the sharpening a little bit. I think I did overdo the sharpening command for the upscaler. That needs to be reduced, or I should just completely stop using upscaling and just force resolution. I've been kind of contemplating whether I should do that or not, because I kind of do enjoy how crisp it looks if you use an upscaler. It looks really good, but I might start to just use native. I mean, technically it is native. I don't really know how the game counts it, because I don't see much of a difference in forcing and using upscaling. It's kind of a weird little thing within the game. But now we are definitely in some serious GPU rendering territory. 1100 MHz clock speed. This is with frame generation enabled naturally. That's why it's being pushed. So even if you set if you set 4K and stay at 60 FPS, you still would not be able to max out the GPU on this thing. This is where frame generation comes into play. Frame generation will definitely max out the GPU if you set 4K resolution. The heat output does kind of point towards that. 197, 105. Yeah, we are pretty much on the limit, on the allowed limit. That's why you will not see the GPU frequency go much higher than what it is right now, because if it were to go higher, it would hit over the throttling threshold, and that would be dangerous. But since this thing is very good at maintaining a certain temperature, this isn't a problem. It's still a very high GPU frequency, and it is delivering above 60 FPS experience on a relatively high resolution. Is it playable? Absolutely more than playable. More than playable, and it's still buttery smooth. So yeah, if I had a better charger, 45 watts charger, maybe I would be able to reduce some of the heat, because now the phone is using both the battery and the charger to supply the processor, because again it requires more than 25 watts now, and once it does that, the battery will be used, and the battery will also contribute to performance drop, and of course the heat that comes along with it. So a better charger in my case would result in a much better experience, in a much higher FPS. Obviously, I almost forgot that we also have the game being a bit buggy currently. So considering all these things, this is some very good performance coming from this thing. And honestly, on the 8 Elite Gen 5 or whatever the name on the new thing is, the difference will be like 20% at most. So even that chip would perform very similar to this one. And that's why I'm saying it's probably not worth upgrading yet. We'll see next year or the year after, but at the moment I'm staying with my 8 Elite. It still does the job really well. 960 MHz, that's relatively high. 1100. We're getting the job done without much of a problem. As I said before, it's very difficult to get this thing to throttle. Very difficult. It is still maintaining the same, but it did mainly maintain that same clock speed throughout the whole fight. Could get 120 FPS if it were locked at 1.2 GHz, but you know, it's fine as it is. But with that being said, that would be it for this little test. If you would want to support me, if you would like to support me, feel free to like and subscribe. And with that being said, stay safe, and as always, I'll see you next time.